Hi, and welcome to the podcast all about ecology. Ecology is the study of how organisms are going to interact with each other and their physical environment. So the first thing we want to have a good understanding of is the levels of organization within our planet. So if we take a look, we start at the smallest level, the individual level. We've talked about this a lot. We've talked about how the molecules and cells and processes within that individual organism are going to interact with each other in order to keep that organism alive. Now what we want to do is figure out, well, how does that organism then interact with all of the other parts of its ecosystem? So if we look at the next level of organization, if we take a look at a group of individuals, a group of these elk living together within the same area, that's what we call a population. Now, if we take a look at the next level, this is what we call a community. This would be the elk herd plus the moose and the lynx and the hare and all of the plants and animals within that same area and how those plants and animals interact with each other within the community. Now, if I add in the abiotic, the non-living factors, the climate, the temperature, the water, the air, and I figure out how those things interact with all of the living species, that's what we call an ecosystem. Now, if I take a look at all of the ecosystems that have similar climates all across the globe, that's what we call a biome. So think like all of the rainforests on the planet. The rainforest is considered a biome. Now, if I look at every area on Earth where life can exist, the global ecosystem is what we call the biosphere. So ecologists can study the interactions between living things and their environments at a bunch of different levels. Today we're going to focus on two specific levels. First, we're going to focus in on this population level, and we're going to learn a little bit about how populations work. So the first major property of populations is their size. This is the total number of individuals in a population, and it's represented by the letter N. So there are a couple of ways that scientists can study population size, and the size of that population can be really influential on how that population is going to exist. So we know that large populations tend to be very healthy, but small populations can be really susceptible to changes in their genetic frequencies, which can lead to evolution or even extinction. Now, it's really difficult to estimate population size, so scientists can do two different things. The first is quadrat sampling. So what they're going to do here is they're going to take a known area and they're going to count all of the organisms within that known area and find kind of an average. And so what they can do then is multiply that small quadrat by the entire space of the population that it lives in, and that can give them a pretty good estimation of how big that population is. Now, another great system is the mark recapture technique. So here's a population of fish. Now, it's going to be very difficult to catch all of these fish and count them. Because they move really easily from place to place. So quadrat sampling is also not a very good option. So what they're going to do is they're going to capture some fish. So they don't know how big this population is, but let's say they capture 26 of those fish and they mark them, maybe with little tags or something like that. And then they let them go, they return them back to the population. Later on, they come back and they capture another group of fish, and then they look at the proportion between the number that are marked and the number that are not. And they're assuming that that proportion is the same for both the entire population and the recapture population. So they can set up a little ratio and cross multiply and solve for the size of the entire population. And that gives us a pretty good estimation of the entire population size. Now, the other property of populations that scientists are going to take a close look at is their density. This is the number of individuals per unit area or volume. So there's a couple of different distributions or types of population density that we want to look at. First is when we have very low population densities. These would be things like large predators. They're not going to be want to clumped too far together because the resources would be limited. So they spread themselves out and have low population densities. Other animals, like ants, for example, live in colonies, and so they want really high population densities because they're going to work together to survive. And so we're going to see very high population densities in animals like the ant. The next is distribution. This is the pattern of spacing of individuals within the area that that population lives in. So there's 3 different types of population distribution. The most common type is clumped, where we see groups of animals living together. So we might see pack animals like wolves clump together in their territories. That helps them to be better hunters, or even animals that might live in a herd or a group or a school of fish, because there's safety in numbers. We also sometimes see a uniform population distribution, and this is going to occur when there is some sort of competition for resources or possibly even aversion to a specific from one individual to the next. So for example, these penguins are going to uniformly disperse so that they're evenly spaced and they don't have to compete for resources. Other times we see this uniform distribution in plant species because an individual plant might secrete a toxin or a chemical that's going to repel other plants from stealing its resources. So we see a very even distribution pattern. And then we also see random patterns, and these random patterns are going to occur when there's really no attraction or repulsion forces. So think these dandelions. We've got some that are growing here, not so many here, and it's totally random where they grow. The next property of populations that we'd like to talk about is survivorship. So when we look at a population, we want to look at the size and composition of that population by age, and we can represent that size and composition using graphs that express how many animals are surviving and also their death rates. So we've got 3 different types of curves. The first one is type 1. This is where we have very low death rate in young and middle-aged individuals, and then as individuals age, we start to see more and more individuals die at a higher rate. Humans are a really good example of type 1 survivorship curves. We have lots of survival with our young and middle-aged people, but as we age, we die more frequently. Type 2 would be where death rates are pretty constant over a lifespan. Organisms are just as likely to die young as they are old. Reptiles are a good example of organisms that follow type 2 survivorship curves. And finally, we have type 3, where we have high death rates among young and low death rates for any surviving organisms. Think fish. They lay a ton of eggs. They don't parent very well, and because they're assuming that a lot of those eggs are going to die, which is why they lay so many. And so we see lots and lots of individuals die when they're very young, but if they survive past their young age into middle age and into upper ages, they survive pretty well. So those are survivorship curves. Next up is age structures. This is where we can look at a population and we can look at the relative number of individuals at each age within a population. And we do this with human population a lot to decide if the population is growing, if it's stable, or if it's declining. So take a look at these age structure diagrams. We can see that they're broken down between males and females within the population, and it shows the relative distribution of ages within the population. So here we see lots and lots of young individuals and very few old individuals. So what that's telling us is that people in the reproductive ages are producing lots and lots of offspring. And as the population ages, the population is going to grow and continue to grow because we're going to see lots and lots of offspring being created. Here we see the same thing. This population is increasing. There's more young individuals than old individuals, but it's expanding much more slowly. This would be an example like of the population of the United States. Now, when we start to see pretty even numbers between the middle age, reproductive age, and the pre-reproductive ages, when those proportions are pretty much the same, that population is pretty stable. Think like Spain or Portugal, where the population is generally staying the same. Now, when we start to see a population distribution that looks like this, where there's very few young individuals and lots of old individuals, and the people who are of reproductive age are producing less offspring, that's going to show that our population is declining. And so ecologists and scientists can learn a lot about a population from these from these age structure diagrams. All right, let's talk a little bit about population growth. Oops, excuse me. Go back here. So population growth can depend on a lot of different things. At what age do organisms reproduce? How long do the organisms live? How many offspring do they reproduce with? And how many times do they reproduce in a lifetime? And all of that is going to give us the biotic potential, the maximum rate at which a population could increase under ideal conditions. And so, yes, we need ideal conditions for populations to grow really quickly, but all of those other things about reproduction are going to play a factor as well. So let's talk a little bit about exponential growth. Oops. When a population has unlimited resources, it can grow very, very quickly. But what will end up happening is that eventually that population is going to run out of those resources and it's going to reach its carrying capacity. So what we're going to start to see is the population overshoot its carrying capacity. It's not going to be able to sustain itself, and the population declines. But now there's a little bit more resources, so it can jump back up. And so where we see this population start to hover, that's what we call the carrying capacity. Now, if I were to look at, in general, this overall curve, it increases exponentially, and then it levels off around the carrying capacity. This is what we call logistic growth. And so this is what we see in most populations because we know that there aren't unlimited resources. Let's talk a little bit about those limiting factors, the things that prevent populations from doing exponential growth always. There are two types of limiting factors. We've got density-dependent and density-independent factors. Density-dependent factors are going to be factors that are going to put larger pressure on the population as that population gets bigger. So take a look at these deer. The more deer we have, the more they're going to have to compete for food, the more waste build up, the more a predator is going to have an effect on that large population, and the faster diseases can spread from individual to individual when they're really close together. Now, density-independent factors, these are going to be factors that are totally unrelated to population density. So think natural disasters. If a tornado rips through a forest, okay, it doesn't matter if there's a small population or a large population within that forest, that twister is going to have an impact on that population and possibly cause it to decline. All right, next up is some growth patterns. So there's a couple of different types of strategies that animals or plants are going to use, and we can look at them and how those populations grow. The first are R strategists. These kinds of organisms produce many young. There's little or no parenting, and the young mature very, very rapidly. They are small when they're born, and these organisms only reproduce once. Think insects. Okay. Now, K strategists are a little different. They produce few young, but they have intensive parenting. The young mature very slowly, they're much larger, and these organisms are going to reproduce many times across their lifespan. Think mammals. So these growth patterns are going to help us to understand a little bit more about how a population can grow. So now that we've talked a little bit about populations, let's go and take a look at one step farther and look at the community.